Okay, so what is a scheme of work, or why is a scheme of work even relevant, is a question that I get asked. And basically, the scheme of work helps assist your universal planning, and it helps the school assist it in its planning as well. You can share your scheme of work with other teachers in your own department, and that helps the whole department understand what's going on. It makes weekly lesson planning even less time consuming. So when you have lots and lots of different classes for different age groups and year groups, you tend to have to write your lesson plans. And if you do that weekly or even daily, like every night before the next day, it's very, very time consuming. So if you've got a scheme of work at the beginning of each term at least, then you can take from the scheme of work all the ideas and the plans, and you can copy paste them into your lesson plan, and it's much less time consuming for you. You can file your schemes of work for reference and use them again the following year. Once you've got plenty of schemes of work ready to use, you can reuse them again and again and again. You can modify them, you can update them, you can correct them, you can do anything you like with them. So they're really, really useful. Schools also file the schemes of work for reference, and if any education ministries need to check what's happening inside the school, they've got the files just in case. So what do? You have to have a topic for your term's education. If you don't have a topic and you want to go ad hoc, you still need to plan it somewhat, so that there's some flow of learning for everybody. You can check what you've done last term by looking through your last scheme of work to see if what you're building on this term actually builds on the learning, and you take that learning curve just that little bit higher. You can also plan your current scheme of work to fall inside what you need for the next term. If you've got other subjects in the school that you can utilize in your scheme of work, you can take cross-curricular learning and education into your scheme of work theme. And there's any other objectives that you might want to cover can also be thought out well ahead of time in the scheme of work. What you need is your school calendar. And school calendars, they tend to be issued for the whole entire year, if not from term to term. And if you check your school calendar, you're going to find that you need to know how many lessons are going to be used in this scheme of work, because every term may be slightly different from the last term in number of weeks. You want to check on school events, because there's lots of things that could happen in a school term that might affect your lessons, and that would definitely affect your planning. Because if you've got cancel classes because of school trips and things like that, or because of school events like an extended assembly or a Christmas play or something that happens, you need to be able to plan around that and not have it get in the way of the learning that you're trying to get across. So assessments, if you've got assessments within your term, you'll need to know what those dates are. And if you've got more than one assessment, you've got to really plan ahead. If you want to use your scheme of work to enable you to assess and to keep track of everything that you've been teaching, then you're going to have excellent information to report at the end of the term or at the end of the year. Before you forget everything, you've got it all tracked out and recorded, and you would need for parent and teacher meetings some exact, like, what have you been teaching my child questions, so you'll be able to answer those. Okay, here's an example of a timetable that I had between 2016 and 2017. Each of my lessons for speech and drama was 1 hour long. And so when I broke it down, I could see that, okay, these classes are going to run back to back. So if you see on a Tuesday, I've got 4 classes back to back with a break in between, but I might be on duty during that break. So I'll need to be covered for the entire day because I won't have time to plan. And likewise, I can count how many weeks I have of these in order to plan effectively. Here is an example of the 2016 to 2017 calendar. I'm using this example because that was the last time I worked inside a school, and I was able to count how many days off we had, what are the special activities. And if you can see on this one, we're going to zoom in on term 2. Term 2 went from January 2017 to March 2017. And because this was an international school, the educational year began in September or late August, and it went on until July. So you can see in blue where all the holidays are. And Malaysia has lots of public holidays, which tend to vary depending on a lunar calendar. So they don't remain the same date every year. So you always need to check which month is this public holiday going to fall in, so that I can count how many exact weeks I've got. So this is term 2. These months of January, February and March, actually, it's just 3 months because April was already the Easter holidays, the spring term break. So let's take a look at that more in detail. We can see the sort of events that were happening in the school. The first 2 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, January 2nd, 3rd were off, but we had a staff inset day on Wednesday and Thursday. There were no students. And on the 6th, we had an orientation morning for new students. So there was no teaching or learning going on in the first week of January. So I have to count how many weeks do I have? Well, everything in white is clear, but there are some events that are going on in the school. We've got a maths and science week, a Chinese New Year holiday, which was a week long from the 30th of January all the way to the 3rd of February. So there was no teaching and learning going on there. We have a primary trip week, which didn't really affect me because I was mostly teaching secondary. And we have a public holiday called Taipusam. It usually falls in February sometime. And then we've got some end of term exams for the year 10 and 11 students. So I have to take that into account because that's going to be 2 weeks long and I'm going to need to take planning into consideration and I must be prepared for my year 10 exams. So let's look at March 2017. We've got those year 10 and 11 exams, but we've also got years 6 to 9 having a week-long set of exams and I've got to prepare papers for that. So I need to know what I'm teaching in order to have something to put in those papers, and I need to come up with some more assessments within the classroom so that I know that I can make reports with grades. I need 3 grades for each term and I need accurate reports of about 3 to 5 lines of words. So I've got to be able to prepare for that. And oh look, there's a sports day. Sports day is going to obviously take students out of the classroom for practice for field events. And we're going to collapse the timetable for the actual sports day event, which we're not sure at this present day if it's going to be on the 24th of March or not, because it depends on a booking. Now, we've also got parent and teacher meetings. So before term 3 begins, we can see that term 2 is incredibly short. Compared to other terms, it is actually a very short term. So how do we plan the learning flow? Well, before we make lesson plans, we've got to use the scheme of work in order to create a nice learning flow for the students. We've got to plan what sort of activities we're putting in the lessons. We've got to make sure that we're addressing each type of learner so that the activities are working well for each type of learner. We can decide whether we want to have pairs, groups, active learning we want to put, and also passive learning so that everybody's not too exhausted within a lesson. We've got to know how many learners are in each class. So roughly for a year group, we can plan for an entire year group if we've got an average number of learners. Therefore, we won't put too many activities in if we've got to cover everybody and assess everybody within the lessons. So we've got to be able to be realistic there. We can put teacher-led activities and we can put student-led activities. That would be really good to plan ahead. Then when it comes to the actual week of learning, we can create the lesson plans or try and create the lesson plans way ahead of time. We also need to be able to plan the assessments so that the learning flow leads to an assessment and nobody's left hanging. They're all clear by the end of it. So we've got to make sure that we recap certain elements of the class so that they will be clear. And if there's any case of absenteeism, then the students who were not there in one lesson will be able to catch up in the next lesson. So we won't have an issue with that. So we plan a nice gentle learning curve for 3 months of a term. Now I'm going to take 1 year group as an example. So for term 2, I'm going to look at year 6. Here is from my long-term planning, which was done at the beginning of the year. I decided already that in term 2, I'm going to use drama vocabulary for my year 6. Why? Because in a short term, I could cut through all the drama vocabulary that I would have been needing to use for the last term, which is a much longer term. The term previous to this, they had learned some Shakespeare. So in the Shakespeare, I was using vocabulary for the drama that enabled them to understand that we use specific vocabulary. And now in term 2, I get a chance to teach that vocabulary and then I can assess it. It can be active, it can be passive, we can do worksheets or we can do active group work. I've got 12 weeks of term, but actually we don't have 12 classes. So to be realistic, we can see that we've got 1 week of Chinese New Year holidays in week 4. We can also see that in week 6, we've got assessments. We've got assessments again in week 8, but in week 9, we have the actual exams. So I planned the 2 initial assessments for week 6 and 8 so that I can do those before week 9 exams. And then I've put the week 11 and 12 as recap with games, because I'm not even sure we're going to reach 11 or 12 classes for all the year 6s. There may be some days where one year 6 class doesn't get to do a lesson. So I've got to take into account that not everyone's going to be able to catch up. So I've used these last 2 weeks as buffer lessons, just in case one year 6 class has it and another year 6 class doesn't. So here we have the scheme of work basic. As you can see, I've got my year 6 classes. There's 3 of them, A, B, and C. This is for the academic year 2016 to 2017 and for the subject speech and drama. We've got a number of sessions. So for each session, I've got a different row to fill in. I've got the topic and the content. So that's like the title of the class. I've got learning outcomes. I've got teaching and learning activities, and I've got the resources. So in order to follow this, I'm going to take you column by column. So the first one, I've decided there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lessons in this scheme of work. So as you remember, there are actually 12 physical weeks for the calendar, but really, realistically, only 9 lessons. The next column that we're going to look at is the topic of each class. So in week 1, we're looking at the topic of movement. And because they've done movement in Shakespeare, when we studied Much Ado About Nothing, the term before, this is just like to get into the motion of using movement and describing movement in vocabulary terms for drama. In week 2, we will be looking at movement, just to clarify if anyone was absent, and to recap for anyone who might have forgotten. But we're going to introduce the topic of characterization. Now, if you're teaching another subject that's not drama, you can build on your learning like this. You recap one lesson and you introduce the next lesson. And then in week 3, we go right into characterization. So if anyone was missing from class in between, they find it much easier to catch up, and you don't have a wide range of grades because everybody understands it. We build on that. In week 4, we have conventions. We've just come back from our Chinese New Year break. So we're going to start with conventions, dramatic conventions. In week 5, we have conventions as a recap, and we introduce form and structure vocabulary. So in week 6, we just look at form and structure. In week 7, we do a practical exploration of all the words that we've used so far. At this point, it's almost like an assessment. I can see whether everybody understands the words that are being used. And then we go to week 8, where we can do language and voice vocabulary. In the last week, we're going to recap all the vocabulary that we have studied. So we can see 9 different topics, but actually we've overlapped a few of them just to make sure that we cover everything. But that's still quite a lot for one term. We've managed to get simplified version of each and every topic. Now we go to the next column, which is the learning outcomes. We are going to now detail what we want the learning outcomes to be. So I use bullet points for this column because we just need to make it in short form. When I'm talking about movement and I'm teaching movement and they're getting up and they're doing some movement, well, what I want them to do is to improve upon the previous study, which was last term. And I want them to understand how to use the space and relate to it with each other. Then I want to be able to get them to understand how to interpret their own physical expression and the use of body. And then I want them to be introduced to ensemble work so that they can put their own movement in with a group. So there's lots of activities for one lesson, but we're all focused on one topic. We go to the next lesson and we're going to recap the movement, but we're also going to introduce characterization. How are they going to interpret the character's movement? How are they going to understand the role of the actor in the script when they're developing characters and get familiar with the concept of role play? Now, there's less learning outcomes here when I introduce a new topic because the learning outcomes of the previous lesson are still valid for this one, because movement learning outcomes is still valid for the learning outcomes of the second lesson. When we go to the third lesson, lesson, we're going to get more in detail about characterization. So we want to understand how characters are different in their personality. We want to get familiar with the concept of walking and talking with different character motivations. And we want to be introduced to the concept of multi-role acting. Now, movement still comes into it, but characterization is a building on movement. And then after the New Year's break, we have the fourth lesson. So for conventions, I want to reinforce the understanding of a role of a character, but yet be familiar with the concept of acting and directing. We want to be able to understand the concept of action and storyline conventions in dramatic role playing. So now we're still building on the previous week's learning, and we've taken everything else into account, but now we're adding something new. So this is why we still only have 3 learning outcomes, because we're still recapping all the previous lessons. For the 5th lesson, I want to reinforce the understanding of the antagonist role, which we would have been covering somewhat before this, but I want them to be familiar with storyline and be able to demonstrate the concept of Shakespearean and Greek drama. Now, if this was a new class to me, I would not have done this. But because I've worked with this year group for at least 3 years, I know that I can draw upon 3 years of work, which is why we've done some basics of Shakespeare and basics of Greek drama before. And so I can bring old classes back and build on the memory of that so that they understand the contextual purpose of conventions, forms, and structure in drama. If I hadn't taught them before, and I've only taught them for 1 term, then I might not go in depth with Shakespeare and Greek drama. In the 6th lesson, I've only got 1 learning objective, because the further we go into the term, the more recapping we're going to do. But I want to make sure that right now, at this point of the learning, they can demonstrate a performance in dialogue using different genres of form and structure. So when we've got the form and the structure, they're going to be trying to remember everything they've learned before. But really, what am I assessing is that they can do this level as well. And then when we get to practical exploration, we want to demonstrate that we can use everything that we've learned appropriately in role play, but also ask them questions verbally. They can answer me using correct vocabulary. And that's why I've only got 1 learning outcome for this, because it's going to take the entire lesson to watch each and every group work and ask questions and get each person at least to try and answer 1 question. And the same thing goes for the 8th lesson. They're going to demonstrate again how much of what they've learned they can use. And this time I'll teach them a little bit more about the language and the voice. And if they can do exactly what they did in week 7, but upgrade their knowledge and skills in week 8 and do it again, then they've built on their knowledge. In week 9, this year 6 group will be able to utilize all the dramatic devising skills. So they can actually create something like a Greek chorus with a tableau, so that they've got some physicality, they've got some voice work, they've got some conventions, they've got everything that we have been learning. And hopefully they just have fun with it and create something. And then I watch them work. So this is a very student-led learning week, but they get to do it all by themselves, and I get to watch, and I can make notes, and I can assess without needing to be the chalk and talk teacher at the front of the class, teaching and teaching and teaching, but not knowing whether they're learning anything. So now we go to the learning activities. And as you can see, I do some demonstration at the beginning, but then I get them set into groups, and I've put timings there. So I've used the board to demonstrate a game, and the game will be a warm-up for the class in the first week for 15 minutes. And then once they get into groups, then I've got activities for 15 minutes and 30 minutes. Now, for a year 6, an age 12 or so, what we can do is we can times their age by 2 and get 24, 25. We can add 2, and we know that there's 27 minutes of attention span for this age group. 30 minutes is not too unreasonable, especially if I'm going to be asking them to take it in turns, so they get to watch each and every other group. 30 minutes for an activity is reasonable. If they were younger, I wouldn't put them through 30 minutes. I might only ask for a 20-minute activity max. So I've worked it out. So I've got 2 15-minute sessions and 1 30-minute session to change activity. If you do one entire activity for an entire class, they've got to be very, very engaged. And in the first lesson, they're not engaged enough. So we've got to get them engaged. And in the second lesson, I've broken it down even more, and I've put 4 different activities. So how am I going to reach my learning outcomes is by doing these activities. In weeks 3 and 4, you can see that I want them to get a little more confident to work in pairs. When they're in groups, it's easier to hide, but when you're in pairs, you've got to step up a bit. So I've got 4 activities here where they are going to be working at first in pairs, and then they're going to be able to work together as a group by the end of the game. In the 4th lesson, we come back and we're just going to do a crossword on the vocabulary to see if everybody can get that. And I'm going to set a time limit to do that crossword of 15 minutes. They've got about 6 or 7 words to figure out from the crossword, which isn't much, and they've got 15 minutes to do it. If they don't finish, that's okay. It just means that I know that it takes them longer to think of a word. So this helps them to write the word down for those who need to see the word written down and not just hear it. And it helps me to keep track of who's able to complete things faster because they know it, and who isn't, and who needs more work. So I get an average relevance for the class in terms of their abilities to reinforce this information. And then we play some games. So we have new learning, we've got some assessment, and we've got some fun activities before I ask them to do something a little bit more technical, which is building on each and every activity that comes before it. In weeks 5 and 6, we're now making larger groups to see if they can work well together. They're either doing comedy, tragedy, or musical in their group, and they're going to have to pick this out of a hat. So once they've got into groups, they don't know what they're getting. This enables us to make the lesson more exciting, and it also is a fun way to learn the conventions and forms and structure of drama. And again, we do this in week 6. We know the rules, that we've all got to come up with something, but this time they pull out of the hat different themes like pantomime, docudrama, and forum theatre. Hopefully, they've been engaged enough in the previous lessons to understand what those are, and to illustrate a perfect example of each. We have an assessment where they're going to be in groups of 3, which is easier for me to write reports if I see smaller groups. So in group of 3, I can write an individual report for each group that I can see. They have 15 minutes to prepare some improvised performance, and then they're going to utilize all those dramatic terms and vocabulary that they've been learning. As long as they can introduce it, then I can ask them questions at the end. At week 8, we're going to explore poetry and 2 specific poems by Ken Nesbitt. My teacher's a hippie, and I rode a rainbow unicorn. So with these 2 poems, we're going to explore the vocal, language and voice aspects of drama. And we're particularly going to focus on clarity, diction, articulation, intonation, tone, pitch, pace, pause, rhythm, emphasis and volume, which are the words that I have put into a crossword ahead of time, so that when I do assess this, I can give them a crossword, and if they can understand what these words mean, I've got a definition, they've got to fill in the blanks. So that's quite easy, but it's also technical, and it gives me enough information about whether they've learned enough of what I've been teaching before I move on. And by the 9th lesson, I've got that buffer, because I don't think every class is going to be able to complete all the way up to the end. So I've got a buffer just in case one class is slightly ahead of the other, or because of the timetable interruptions, there's a public holiday somewhere on Tuesday and one class gets left behind. So I've got games that relate to the topics that we've been learning: space jump and beach boat bank, which are very tableau movement, physicality, but also it's fun because we can use words now to describe the movements and describe the physicality. Resources, well, I have to create these word search puzzles to fit my topics. And I've made ahead of time character cards with different postures for these characters, which I laminated, very simple stick figures, and I can bring them out class after class after class to reinforce the learning with some visual images. So most of the time I'm using crossword puzzles, and word searches. There's lots of places where you can go and do crossword creation in 10 minutes. For the last lesson, I don't need any resources to play these games. I anticipated well when I look back. Yes, it was correct. 2 classes didn't make it to week 9 because of the timetable disruptions, but 1 class did. So there was 1 class that I was prepared for to play games with. That worked out well. I didn't need any resources. By the end of the term, you're too fatigued to be able to find all your resources anyway. So it was great. And here is an image of the entire scheme of work, which I've patched together. It was over 4 pieces of paper of A4 size. But when I patch them together, you can see there's a flow and it's easy to follow. You just go column to column, row to row, and everything is there. So that is an example of a scheme of work. Cross-curricular planning. In cross-curricular planning, you get to impress your other teachers, but at the same time, you can utilize your subject to help learners in other subjects. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I did in term 2 of 2017. I did do cross-curricular planning because of the activities. These activities in the timetable could be considered a disruption, but I utilized it to make it work for me. So we can see there's a primary and secondary sports day in March. Now, if I worked from January preparing my learners through drama to be prepared for sports day, then I've achieved an objective of cross-curricular education, because sports day is managed by the PE department, and the PE and drama are not considered relatable subjects except by being physical. But something about sports day is very showcasing, and each of the students is put into a house. There are 4 houses in the school, and each house has a different color. If I utilize the house parade at the beginning of the sports day event by creating something for my drama lessons, which the PE department can't quite cover in their lessons when they're practicing for sports day. Well, this is what I did. Year 9, which is doing speech and drama related to the 0411 Cambridge curriculum, we are learning how to take commedia dell'arte characters and turn them into characters that could be mascots. Previously, we had done theatre practitioners and we looked at Stanislavski, and that was quite a heavy term 1 for year 9. They came back to school after leaving year 8, they returned to join year 9, and I put them straight into something quite difficult and challenging, Stanislavski. So for this term, considering it's short and that we have a sports day, I'll do something fun. I've got 9 weeks, slightly more learners per class, but that's okay because I'm going to break them into their house groups. The momentum for sports day and the excitement doesn't generally pick up from the beginning of the term, but when they come back in February after Chinese New Year, the momentum for the sports day event starts to take place. Sometimes students are pulled out of class to do field events and to record their timings. So there is a little more disruption. So it's nice if we can work in groups. That means that there's a team behind them even when they're absent from the class. So first I introduce them to commedia dell'arte characters, presuming nobody has any knowledge or experience of these. I use slides and I do quizzes at the end of each lesson, but I start getting them used to working in groups. So the quizzes are done in groups, and they have to answer physical multiple choice answers. So for instance, if they agree with answer A, they put their hands on their head and the whole team has to do it together. And if they agree with answer B, then they put their hands on the shoulders and so on. And that gets them lively, it gets them upbeat. Don't forget year 9, their teams. You have to kind of shake them up a bit to get them to be physical, otherwise they will tend to sleep through the class. So how to wake them up is to get them to laugh, get them to have fun, get them to enjoy things, and get them moving. When we get into the character analysis, we start from week 3 looking at specific characters, and we build on that learning. We compare the differences between them. We take note of their characterization, their movement, their posture, and the colors. Once we have done most of the characters, we can start looking at costumes. Now they're going to have to do costume making in class. It's going to be messy, and Maybe they don't know how to sew, but if they've got scraps and bits and somebody knows how to paint and somebody knows how to cut things and somebody knows how to stick glitter on, that's okay. We're not going to be asking for most dazzling costumes for the Rio de Janeiro Carnival. What we're asking for is something reasonable that is showy, that they can have fun with, and they can also learn from. And also, I've got to be able to assess them. So part of my planning is to use the group work costumes as an assessment. Do they understand what it is? Can they explain why they've used this item and not that item? Can they explain what color they've used and why? And then there's some general knowledge about the history of Commedia dell'arte. So we've got 9 lessons, and we're not sure if everyone is going to be able to join in the 9th lesson, but at least if they don't have a 9th lesson, they at least have the sports day to show how much they've learned by demonstrating a full character in costume parading across the track in front of their house. Here's the rest of the scheme of work, and we are assessing. So we are serious even though we're having fun. They do recognize that they have exams on this, and they do have to pay attention when we do the theatre history and origin of these costumes. They need to know the theory behind all the fun stuff. You can see in week 6 we have homework to gather suitable items. Now they've got a whole week. They can find things from home, they can get scraps, they can bring in old clothes, they can find things in the art department if they want to, they can go to shops and buy things. They've got a whole week because of their lessons being 1 week apart. And I know in advance when that is that they're going to need all this stuff so that I can prepare them a week before, you know, that you're going to need to collect things. And then on the day, I could say, this is your homework, so that when they do come back the following week, they have been reminded and they do it. And here you can see the full Year 9 scheme of work laid out for 9 weeks of learning. There were appropriate examinations, 1 on paper, 2 practical for this year group. And each of the students were able to garner 3 grades for the entire term, even though it was very short. And they got a report at the end, which was very individual based on their individual role within their group and how they answered the question papers. For the Maths and Science week, they were learning devising, how to devise a drama, which they were going to put on in front of the school for Maths and Science week. So they were rehearsing, they needed to research information about the history of maths and science. They needed to come up with a story idea, characters, and a theme. There was some very great scientists from France. Those who took French got to enact some of the dialogue in French. We put slides up on the wall during the 20-minute performance, and we had music, we had slides. It was funny. They had wigs, costumes, but they were doing quick changes by going back through time and meeting famous mathematicians and scientists. And they had a lot of fun out of it. So it was called The Magic Carpet Ride Through Time and Space. And our characters were Dr. Tim Kronos and Professor Matthew Matix, who were a bit Doctor Who-ish in nature and time travelled on a magic carpet. So they went all the way back to ancient Babylon. It was fun creating the special effects, the sound. It was fun to do the characters. It was fun rehearsing, creating scenery and props. And they learnt a lot for their IGCSE unit on devising drama. So I was able to assess them as I would normally, but this cross-curricular opportunity gave me a lot to work with. It gave me the theme, and it gave me some structure, and it gave me a timing so that I could work towards that. And I do see the Year 10s for 3 hours a week, and I can recall that 2 of those lessons were pretty much back to back. So it was quite in-depth and we did quite a lot of work. Plus we were still studying another play. The assessment was on devised drama with the theme of maths and science. The examination that I gave them, the written paper, was 30%. I also gave them peer assessment and self-assessment so that they could reflect on their work and be able to write an essay. How did I mark it? Well, 5 marks for script writing, 5 marks for character development, 5 marks for directing, 5 marks for costume, 5 marks for props, and 5 marks for performance skills. But I had to know this before I started teaching it, that this is what I was going to do for my assessment. So they had to mark themselves, reflect on it, write an essay and do a written paper. But also I could assess the final performance. So I had lots of ways to mark them so that each one got an individual mark and an individual report. So when it comes to writing a scheme of work, and if you have formative and summative assessments, you've got to be clear from the beginning how you're going to approach that. At which point in the learning curve do you need to create some form of assessment before you move on? So generally, assessment is not about getting A's and whatnot. It's to know from a teacher's perspective whether what you've been teaching has been successful. So really, what we have is assessments to know if students are learning. And if they're not learning, well, then you've got plenty of time within the term to address that. No scheme of work has to be set in stone. Once you've created it, you can always adjust it. Once you've made your scheme of work, if you do submit it, there are certain elements that are expected, where and how you're going to assess, what topic you're going to assess your learners on. So you get used to it, but it takes that perspective of looking at the bigger picture before you zoom in on each and every lesson to know how to use it. And that's why it's useful. Some assessments are optional. You can just add them in week to week if you need them. But know where, from looking at your scheme of work, which activities you can assess, which activities you can't. You can actually do your own optional assessments on your learners. So you might need one assessment at the end of a year. You might need one assessment at the end of each term. You might need 3 assessments per term, which is what I had in my case. So that was 9 assessments for an entire year. You need to be able to identify particular grades and reports that are accurate. If you don't plan well ahead, your grades are going to be all over the place because you don't know what you're assessing. And then your reports are going to be not very individual because you're not keeping track of what you're doing. So this helps you in advance. Creating a scheme of work in the school holidays, if possible. If you've got a teacher inset day and they give you time to do your schemes of work, then you can use that time. If you've got previous schemes of work from former years that you want to recycle, you can. There's no one saying that that's not allowed. You also need to report back to parents. So when you have a parent and teacher meeting at the end of a term, you can say, well, look, this is all the coursework that we did. You've got at least one document that shows all the different coursework. And then when you plan for your next term, you've got everything recorded in detail about what you've done in the current term. And you can always keep these on file. And as you can see, I had year 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And this is their assessment scope. So I was able to do schemes of work for each year group. Year 6 and 7 were similar. Their exams were slightly different. Year 8, we did radio plays. Year 9, commedia dell'arte. And year 10, scripted drama. So they had 2 types of scripted drama. One was a set play, which is published play, and one was devised scripted drama. And it all worked out very well. For 3 months, it was not too difficult. It's a tight squeeze, but it's very doable. When you have a layout for your scheme of work, you can choose whichever layout suits you best. Sometimes you might want to work vertically instead of horizontally. I much prefer horizontal, and a horizontal layout is the most popular from what I can see. Do you want to try a template? You can download templates from the internet. Sometimes the school has their own template, which they say they want this. So you just follow the template that they give you. But now when you see all those blank boxes, you know what's going to go in them and why. And it doesn't seem like so much of a waste of time. There's required information that sometimes is asked of you, like the topics and the activities. You don't have to go into great detail. I like to put more detail in because then I can copy paste it into my lesson plans. And then there's other optional information, maybe your resources, maybe notes that you want to make. Here's a sample from the internet. This is from xtlearn.net. Here's another sample for language. So it's a textbook type class where the subject has to go through the particular textbook that's been issued by the school. And so they've got extra columns and boxes to fill in. And then from CityLit, you can find another version. They're all similar. You can modify it, or you could come up with your own. but the general idea is the same. You're planning your scheme of work so that you know what you're doing for each and every lesson, and you understand the learning curve, that there's no major jumps or leaps. You're simply taking them from one lesson, building from that learning experience to the next lesson. And you plan it like that. It's a very broad spectrum of what you're going to do for an entire term for this whole year group. So you only need one whole year group scheme of work. You don't need to create a different one for each class. Next up, I'm going to teach you about lesson plans, because that's another question I get a lot. How do you make a lesson plan? Well, that will be a whole new video. If you've got any questions, you can pop them in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Thank you so much for your attention. If this was good, let us know. If you want more, let us know. I'm happy to help. This is Amina from MoOne Drama signing off. Bye.